Excellent. It certainly looks like I'm live. I'm just doing a audio check on this. Got that. I think I'm live. I'm just doing. There we go. Excellent. Well, a warm welcome to the channel, the Sydney Winston channel. I'm Sydney Winston. We're currently running a 36 lecture series on evil. We're on lecture number 4 today. It's entitled Greek Philosophy, Human Evil and Malice. The lecture is presented by Dr. Charles Mathewes from the University of Virginia. And without further hanging around and mucking around, let's get into it.
Hello again. So far in these lectures, we've looked primarily at events and at people thinking about events. Now we're going to begin to look at people who are reflecting on just that, on reflecting on how people think about events. This is in some ways one classic definition of what a philosopher does. The Greek tragic tradition met a certain kind of internal resistance within the Greek context, within Greece itself, in the form of the tradition of philosophy, which deserves its own distinct attention. That's what we'll give it in this lecture. These philosophers certainly take reality and history seriously, but they're also seriously interested in assessing the strengths and weaknesses of people's views of reality in order to determine how best to think about these matters. Now here, we'll study how Plato and Aristotle thought about evil, human malice, and tragedy, both as allies together against the view of the Greek tragedians and Thucydides, and also as themselves, Plato and Aristotle, offering two rival accounts of the nature of the human condition and the human fault. The disagreements between them and their mutual opposition to tragedy echo down through the rest of the Western philosophical and religious traditions. The debates these guys have in a small corner of Greece 2,500 years ago have really incredibly shaped everything that came after that. Let me start with Plato first. Plato's dates, we're pretty confident of them. Plato was born around 428 BCE and died in 347 BCE. He was an Athenian. He was a disciple of Socrates. He was the teacher of Aristotle. We know that Plato wrote not just the dialogues we have, but a number of lectures that were also compiled into books and were available in the ancient world. We've lost those, but we do have the dialogues. Now, these dialogues purport to tell stories of events in Socrates' life. In other words, Socrates is more or less pretty commonly always the main character in these dialogues. Now, the earliest dialogues have a pretty historical reporting of actual events in Socrates' life, especially the ones around the death of Socrates. Those seem to be almost journalistic reports of what actually happened. Maybe a little sanding of the edges or something like that, but by and large, Plato is really trying to tell the story of Socrates' life. But over time, in the dialogues, the character Socrates becomes less and less historical, less and less rooted in the actual historical figure, and more a literary figure who Plato uses to convey the story he wants to tell. Now, that's not to say that you can just identify Plato's views with the views of the character in his dialogue named Socrates. Indeed, as the older Plato gets, the more he's his own person, his own thinker, and not just Socrates' student, Socrates' disciple. The more fictional the character Socrates gets in Plato's dialogues. And that means the more Plato uses this figure in combination with the others in his dialogues to promote the idea that his thoughts, Plato's thoughts, are in some sense arising from the conversation itself. Plato's thoughts are in some sense in between the various figures of the dialogue. Plato, who people think of as someone who really hates art or despises or suspects poetry, remember, Plato has always been a remarkable artist and a fantastic writer. Never, ever forget that. It's an important thing about his own work to keep in mind. Now, Plato's thinking about evil developed really significantly over time. Initially, in his early dialogues and for the first few years, his own kind of free thinking on things, he seems to have thought, or at least reported that Socrates thought, and young Plato believed him, that evil is a consequence of ignorance, that no one goes against their well-formed judgment, and that such judgment, such a well-formed judgment, can never truly be evil. This is the view expressed, for example, in Plato's early dialogue, the Protagoras. Now, in this dialogue, ignorance of the most serious kind, truly dangerous ignorance, is the basis of all wrong action, right? So in this passage I'm about to read to you, notice how fundamentally evil is connected with the fact that the evildoer, on the character Socrates' account here, must simply not be thinking right, okay? So this is Socrates. No one willingly pursues evil, or at least what he takes to be evil. Human nature forbids that. Furthermore, faced with a choice of two evils, that is, faced in a way that a person will know that he faces or she faces a choice of two evils, back to Socrates here, faced with a choice of two evils, no one will choose the greater if he can choose the lesser. Now, on one level, this is all pretty good common sense, right? That if you're confronted with something you know is evil, you're going to avoid it. Plato's idea, at least as presented by Socrates here, is that because virtue is teachable, because we can be informed and made better by the possibility of people giving us new information or data about our situation, and because the process of teaching is the informing of the person with knowledge that they did not have before, where this informing is a pretty deep concept. It's not actually simply just giving people data. It's also, in a way, shaping their soul to receive that data properly. And because faults can usually be corrected in our ordinary experience, Plato/Socrates seems to think here, because fault can usually be corrected in our ordinary experience by giving someone more articulate help in seeing the full character of the situation, the full dimensions of it, by giving them, that is, more information. Therefore, evil, he thinks, is a matter fundamentally of not being in the right situation to know what to do. Evil's a matter of miseducation, and this can be corrected by better information. Now, there's a lot to be said for this view, right? For us today, we do often believe that a lot of the evil we face in our world is simply a matter of ignorance. It's bigotry, it's shallow aims that would be enriched and deepened and altered if we were properly educated. We talk about people being badly brought up. And it's not just a matter of our opinions, that we have data about this. We actually think that a lot of people make bad choices in their lives precisely because they don't know any better, right? So there's a lot of power in this view, and we shouldn't just dismiss it. The ancients certainly didn't. Many people who disagree profoundly with Plato on other things do, in fact, agree with him on this. The early Plato, agree with the early Plato on this. A great example of this tradition is found in later philosophers, even Stoics, who are far from being followers of Plato. Consider this example from Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, another wonderful book. This is Aurelius. You get it here? The Meditations is Aurelius's actual private diaries, the only private diary we have of an emperor. It's an astonishing book. Just to pause for a second on that. Imagine if a president were to write a book entirely for his own or her own purposes, a book of her own thinking, her own dreams, her hopes, her discipline about how she lives her days in office. And then that book goes missing and is discovered 100 years, 200 years later. That's the sort of thing that the Meditations are. Fantastic, incredible work of a truly brilliant philosopher. But this is Aurelius in the Meditations. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. That's Aurelius. One interesting thing just to note about that is it's amazing to imagine a Roman emperor trying to confront these people and saying, you know, I'm just dealing with some surly people here. I mean, any other emperor apart from Aurelius probably would have just taken these people outside and had them killed, right? Someone is surly to the emperor, this is not a good idea. It's a fascinating clue about Aurelius's character as a person, right? Is that he doesn't want to kill them, he just tries to understand who they are and negotiate the way around their difficulties in dealing with them. Anyway, that's just about Aurelius. What's crucial about this for our purposes here, though, is that the picture here Aurelius offers, which reinforces Plato's picture, suggests that people are pretty much the same inside, except that some people just have one set of skills better developed and a little bit more information than other people, right? If every other person had the ability to tell right from wrong in this way, they wouldn't be so bad. And if they had more information, they'd be able to make better judgments. In some important way, this is a pretty optimistic picture of evil, right? So far so good. But as time went on for Plato, his views darkened, became more sober. By the middle of his life, he understands evil, Plato understands evil, in a more profound and complicated and troubling way. And his depiction of the differences between good and bad people has become far more radical. And this is probably seen best in his discussion of the dangers of the irrational, most famously represented in the character Trasmicus in The Republic, in Plato's fabulous dialogue, The Republic. Now, Trasmicus is an interesting figure who really only features in the first book of The Republic. The Republic has 10 books. He's really in the first book. He pops up a couple times later in the dialogue as the evening of the conversation goes on. But it's really only in the first one, where he and Socrates have a very fierce debate about the nature of justice. Trasmicus is a sophist. A sophist is someone who teaches people the arts of political rhetoric. He's kind of for people like Plato, he's a combination of both a spin doctor and a lobbyist in a certain way, or a consultant to lobbyists. He's not a very favored person in Plato's world. And in this dialogue, in the first book of this dialogue, he claims, and to try to defend, and Socrates and he talk about this, Trasmicus claims that justice is just the interest of the stronger. Interestingly, as it comes out in the conversation, this isn't really even a definition of justice. It's kind of a use of words meant to bully others into submission by Trasmicus. Because what does it mean to say that justice is the interest of the stronger? That's, in some ways, itself not a definition. It's the attempt to refuse the point of giving a definition precisely because the point of that idea of what justice is and the point of Trasmicus' own words are in some sense basically just to use force where people would actually like to have understanding. Trasmicus debates Socrates, that is, really effectively just to get submission from Socrates, not to get understanding or cognitive agreement. In fact, Trasmicus' name in Greek actually means fierce or terrible fighter. Trasmikos, makos is a warrior. And he's presented in this first book especially as roaring, sweating, shaking, loud and blustery. He blushes at times. He's not fully in control of his body or his emotions, which in fact, the emotions are really just an aspect of his body for Plato and the Greeks. In a certain way, his body is in control of him, but his body isn't coherent. It's a series of passions and desires. What Trasmicus wants most of all is just to get his own way, to intimidate other people. Though what his own way is just what his body is telling him it wants. So he is kind of a tyrant, but he is himself also tyrannized by the bodily components that go into him. When Trasmicus can't intimidate the other people in the conversation, especially Socrates, into agreeing with him, or at least being silent, which he would think of as almost as acceptable, he withdraws into a kind of surly silence of his own for most of the rest of the dialogue. Now, it's hard to give an account of what Trasmicus is doing here in cognitive terms in language, precisely because that's exactly the challenge Trasmicus presents in the dialogue. He represents for Plato a really crucial problem for social order and for harmony. He can't really be engaged in an intellectually serious manner. Trasmicus is more of a symptom of a world gone mad, a symptom that must be diagnosed and for which a cure must be found and prescribed. But let's face it, considering the first idea Plato had of evil, that evil is in some sense ignorance, no amount of new information is going to help Trasmicus. For starters, he's not really interested in changing. Indeed, he's not really interested in information. He doesn't want to learn. He doesn't want to talk with people, really. He just wants to dominate, at least as he understands domination. Now, here then in the Republic, this great classic middle dialogue of Plato's, Plato has deepened his sense of the connection between goodness and intelligibility. Goodness remains the properly intelligible thing to do, as in his younger view, but now unintelligibility, the irrationality of evil, has become more profound and radical in the human character, especially in those characters who are not, in some sense, on the road to intelligibility, on the road to rationality. Trasmicus is not just incapacitated in his knowledge of good and evil, a la Marcus Aurelius. He's incapacitated in his larger intellectual grip on the world as a whole. Indeed, he has no intellectual grip on the world. His response to reality, to the world, is more really a matter of irritable, appetitive reactions to not fully understood stimuli. This is not a properly thoughtful human response. Indeed, Plato suggests, in an important way, it's not properly human at all. Trasmicus, then, represents a terrifying challenge to Plato. And remember that it was people like Trasmicus who, in a few years, would end up, after the dialogue is written, after the time of the dialogue, a few years later, would end up ordering Socrates to be killed. And this is an important thing about this dialogue. Socrates' death shadows, is looming over the whole dialogue. It's looming over all of Plato's dialogues. It's a strange but really important fact to realize that in the history of Western literature, there are really only two characters who, in everything we have written about them, have already experienced their own death. In other words, the characters may not give evidence of having experienced their own death, but the authors writing about them know the destiny of these two characters. The two characters are Socrates and Jesus. Everything we have about Socrates and about Jesus are all written in the shadow of what ultimately is their fate. The worry about Trasmicus with Plato is not just that he's silly or harmless or stupid or he'll just go off in a corner and brood on his own. The worry is that we live in a world where Trasmicuses also live. And the world that we live in is often one governed by people who are like Trasmicus. What should we do about that? That is, in some ways, after the first book of the dialogue, the fundamental question of the rest of the Republic. How should we live in a world governed by people who are not really on the way to being intelligible creatures? That's a terrifying question, actually. And in a way, Plato must ask two important questions here, two distinct questions. First, how far can the wholly irrational, what Plato calls the alogon, the completely irrational, how far can the alogon be brought into the realm of logos, the realm of reason, of discourse, of conversation, the realm of human intelligibility? How far can Trasmicus be brought into the conversation of the Republic? And what does his being brought into it look like? And then secondly, if we can't finally bring this alogon into the realm of logos, if we can't finally bring the figure of Trasmicus into the realm of intelligibility, how can we improve the social order, our political world, our world in general, so that there are fewer Trasmicuses in the future? Evil is here not so easily captured in descriptions of accident and ignorance. Here evil seems more tenaciously part of our world, more difficult to correct, and requiring far more fundamental changes for us to be unsusceptible to its attractions than the mere delivery of more information to those caught in its clutches. Questions such as these prompted Plato to explore the nature of human malice and malady in a new way, a way that no one had ever done it before him. He saw something that people before him had not seen, or had not seen in the same way and with the same power. Namely, that the cultural context in which everyone lived was powerfully shaping our sense of what is right and what is wrong. Indeed, it is misshaping that. And this is why Plato, and after him in a different way Aristotle, both critique the tragedians and Thucydides. Now, he's often accused of hating poetry and any form of creative fictional expression. This is an odd accusation, right, given the fact that his works are all artful dialogues. In fact, in one of them, I think it's the last one, the Laws, he actually says that the city that they are composing, the city that they are imagining, is the best kind of tragedy available. The problem for Plato is not with the idea of tragedy or the idea of creative thinking, abstract thinking, utopian thinking, imagining a rival city, a perfect city. The problem is how people have represented what would go into that perfect city, what goes into their pictures of what is normative about the world. It's not that he hates the form of poetry, he hates the content of poetry. Plato is in this way really usefully understood as kind of the first critic of the mass media. Now for Plato, evil is seen as an importantly political fact, a reality whose existence and continued flourishing, or continued toleration anyway, by us humans, is due to the way the human world is organized. Culturally, we teach our children these stories, and these stories slowly mislead us. They miseducate us in important ways about how the world is, in fact, really determined. Remember the end of the women of Trachis, right? There is nothing here that is not Zeus. There is nothing in this tragic scene that the gods did not order. Plato thinks that's incredibly dangerous to teach children. And so Plato offers what really amounts to the first truly radical critique of the way humans ordinarily live and organize their lives. And in doing this, Plato is attempting to suggest that the kind of inquiry he undertakes is actually an enormously courageous inquiry. One of the most interesting things about the Republic, this dialogue, the Republic, is precisely the way that Plato takes a language in there of courage and bravery, fortitude, fear, anxiety, danger, all these terms, which are originally militarily organized terms. They're terms originally used for combat and battle in Greek. And he continually suggests that the proper way to understand the real meaning of these words, where real courage lies, is actually in the kind of inquiry that he and his friends are undertaking. Now he's doing this not to kind of mock soldiers, right? Because Plato and his friends were the military of Athens. Every citizen of Athens would fight in the army when there was a battle. So it's not like he's saying that in some sense we're better than those soldiers. Plato and his friends were the soldiers. He's just saying instead, real courage is manifest by us, not so much on the battlefield, right? Not so much there, but rather real courage is manifest by us when we ask these fundamental questions about the nature and structure of our world. All right, so let me go on then. So in this sense, evil for Plato is a cultural and political fact, but it's also, he comes to see, interestingly, a kind of quasi-theological fact. It's a failure to be properly aligned with the moral order, and thus with the God for Plato. And here's the first time we begin to see develop, outside of the Hebrew Bible, theme we'll see there as well, a crucial theme, the idea that evil is not simply a moral violation, a break in the horizontal human world, but is in some sense a rupture of a vertical relation we are supposed to have with God. It's a kind of metaphysical revolt. I mean, consider how anarchic Trasmicus seems, how jumbled he is. Plato depicts him this way at the beginning of the Republic, and by the end of that Republic, he's given us an abstract philosophical description of the sort of person whom Trasmicus is meant to represent. That is, the person caught in a kind of tyrannical soul. And a tyrant is, for Plato, first and foremost, a disordered soul, one who tyrannizes himself before anyone else. And why is the tyrant tyrannizing himself? Because the tyrant is revolting against the conditions of his own creation. That's the mature picture of evil that Plato offers. One where evil is far more radically a form of revolt against the conditions of our own creation, and one that spreads that evil through human society by infecting other people with a misorientation to the good through giving them bad cultural standards to try to live up to. That is, in some ways, the ultimate representation of evil for Plato. Now, in contrast, Aristotle, his student, explores the nature of evil in a far more mundane or worldly way through the discussion of a term that he makes famous, akrasia, or weakness of will. Now, it's too simple and inaccurate and misleading to say that evil is a matter of sheer ignorance. Aristotle buys that. Why? Because sometimes you know the good, but you do the bad anyway. Anyone who has tried to go on a diet knows all about that. Often it's the case that, in fact, the weakness of will that we suffer from makes us do things that our minds tell us we shouldn't do. So clearly, Aristotle rejects the early Plato's idea that information is, in some sense, the crucial ingredient that evil people are lacking. But he also thinks that the later Plato remained both, in a way, too rationalist and too theological about the nature of evil. People can be wrongly habituated for Aristotle, just like Plato. But neither good nor bad habits are rational, not in the way that Plato thought good habits are. Humans, that is, are not simply aligned just to the God, as Plato thought they would be. And evil is not a rupture of that relationship. Humans are as much flesh as they are mind. And the flesh part of humans, for Aristotle, matters as much, shapes a good deal of human behavior in fundamental ways. Plato seemed to think that our bodies would eventually become wholly subservient to our minds, that in some ways they would become offshoots of the mind. Aristotle wants to say that's not true. The point here is to find a happy medium where the mind and the body interact in a responsible way with their distinct, though not ideally conflicting, interests and ends, and how they work together to accomplish everything. This also means that evil has to be rethought for Aristotle. It's not a matter of a radical rejection of intellect for flesh. It's a more mundane problem than that. It's not really a matter of absolute revolt against nature, but a misordering, a jumbling of our natural drives. Aristotle has no patience for Plato's idea that humans can radically revolt against their natural makeup, the conditions of their existence. We're not that transcendent, right? So this is interesting. Plato's picture of evil is far more dramatic and radical than Aristotle's, but that's also because Plato has a far more elevated picture of what humans should be. Aristotle has a more moderate picture of what humans are, and therefore his picture of evil is also less dramatic. Humans exist, by and large, for Aristotle, on a continuum between roughly coherent people and people for whom moral integrity of any sort is a pipe dream. People such as addicts or certain kinds of psychopaths. Now this means, of course, that for Aristotle, not all people can be made better, right? Much like the representation of Trasmicus, Aristotle has a picture where some people are just really not really worth saving. They can't be saved in a way. Aristotle then can be seen to be offering a kind of medicalization of evil, treating it not in very dramatic terms, but rather as seeing it as a certain kind of unfortunate pathology, towards which certain individuals in certain circumstances are prone. Now, this does work against our tendency to over-dramatize evil, even to melodramatize it, like Plato perhaps did. It helps us resist any temptation to make evil seem something with a certain demonic grandeur or magnificence. And it also asks us to see in evil a certain set of clinical symptoms that we, with proper philosophical detachment, may be able to address. So Aristotle's is a much more moderate, a much more sober picture of evil than Plato, but possibly also more hopeful, at least moderately hopeful, for the possibilities of some improvement for most of us. But both Plato and Aristotle are united in one thing that makes them different from some of the other thinkers that we'll see a little later. They are very skeptical of the possibility of radical human change after childhood. Aristotle and Plato, unlike, say, the Christian accounts like St. Paul's, are not really hopeful about human abilities to change. And this is just a general question I want to put to you. Is it really possible for people, once they are more or less properly morally formed, age, 10, 12, 15, however you think, is it really possible for those people to change much? That's a deep question, and it's one that's worth pondering throughout all these lectures. But anyway, the struggle between the Platonist and the Aristotelian views of the ultimate nature of evil echoes across the rest of this lecture series. Here, in quick compass, is a summary of these two views. First, Plato's view sees in evil a more radical and perhaps even theological challenge, a sign of a kind of metaphysical revolt. But he also sees humans as, in some ways, quite elevated because of this, and evil as something that is possibly fixable in some ultimate way. Because if we can design our societies so that they are not rendering us susceptible to evil, perhaps evil will go away. Aristotle's view sees evil as a fairly mundane challenge, a matter of how to organize our relatively messed up natures, and is always at best a sloppily designed, sloppily put together society populated by sloppily put together people. Now this is paired for Aristotle both with a more moderate picture of human nature, one where humans are mind and flesh and some combination of those two things, and not as theologically ambitious as Plato's. But it's also, so it's more modest about humans, but it's also less dramatic and, as I said, possibly melodramatic about evil. Because evil is natural. It might not be really amenable to much social engineering of the sort that Plato says. And because of that, Aristotle can be seen as more cautious than Plato is, both in assessing the threat of evil and in prescribing a remedy to it. And as I said, the debate between these two views will be long-standing, permanent throughout our lectures, really. All right, let me wrap this up. We've now seen two major bodies of literature on evil. The texts of the ancient Near East, which talk about evil as part of a cosmic struggle of the gods. And now the work of the ancient Greeks, which differ quite a bit among themselves, but collectively talk not so much about a cosmic battle in which humans are innocent bystanders, but rather a conflict between humans and the ordering, or sometimes, as for the tragedians, the disordering principles of the cosmos. I want to turn next to some texts in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament as well, before moving on to the Christian New Testament. These sources begin to bring together the two streams of thought about evil we've seen begun in these last 4 lectures, but also they add their own little extra stuff as well.